right, so here we are. It is February 16th. Obviously, have not held true to reading the scripture, breaking it down, doing a video every single day. And we're here. Just gonna own it. And just kind of try to recommit to it because that's something that I still want to do. And it's Monday, coming up on Ash Wednesday, Lent season, and just, trying to get into the word like how I say I want to get into it and just understand it. But I still been, interacting with it in other ways. Still listening to gospel every morning. Still going to church. If I'm not going to church, I'm watching church. And then also been reading, really more so listening to Power Moves by Sarah Jakes Roberts, which is of course backed by faith and scripture and things like that too. So still interacting with that word. But here we go, recommitting. So moving on, right now we're talking about lineage from Adam to Noah. So we are looking at Genesis 5, verses 1 through 32, and then also a little piece of First Chronicles. So First Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And at face value, it does just look like a list of names and just lineage for whatever reason. But it is actually structured genealogy, and it is this structured genealogy from Adam to Noah specifically, and it traces the line of Seth. And so that's important because looking back on Genesis 4, when Seth comes about, right after God granted Adam another child in place of Abel since Cain killed them. Seth also had a son, Enosh. And then what's happening here is at the time people began to call on the name of the Lord. So that's from Genesis 4. So Seth is of this line basically that calls on the name of the Lord. So what happens? Basically, this chapter of Genesis starts with, this is the book of the generations of Adam. But here there is this deliberate piece of humans still being made in God's image, like that is named, male and females being created, that is named again, and then also naming again that they are blessed by God, because even after the fall, right, the things that happened in Eden, Cain's violence, humanity is still yet again described in God's image. So there's like this repeated pattern. So for most of the individuals that are listed throughout the genealogy, it follows like this formula. He lived X amount of years. He fathered a son. He lived Y amount of more years. He had other sons and daughters. And then he lived a total of these years, right? And then he died. So that whole, and then he died, and then he died, and then he died, that is repeated throughout the entire chapter, basically. So the only individuals that are then listed are, we go from Adam to then Seth, who has Enosh, who then has Kenan, who then has Mahalalel, who then has Jared, who then has Enoch, who then has Methuselah, who then has Lamech, and then Lamech, who then has Noah. I do want to say Enoch and Lamech are, remember, these are of Seth's line. This is not of Cain's line, okay? And of these men that are listed where it's like the and then he died, Enoch is the only exception to this. So Enoch, when Enoch comes about, it is, instead of and he died, it was, the text tells us that Enoch walked with God, and then it tells us that Enoch, then he was no more because God took him. Something special about Enoch as well is Enoch lives a total of 365 years, which is probably like symbolically linked to completeness, like days in a year. And he does not, again, he does not follow that and he died pattern. And then Methuselah is of mention as well, because Methuselah lives 969 years, which is the longest lifespan recorded in the Bible. And it says that his lifespan stretches nearly to the flood narrative, chronologically. And then Lamech, okay? So Lamech is special because Lamech is who fathers Noah. And Lamech delivers the prophecy about Noah. He says that he names him Noah because Noah is going to comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. Which directly goes back to Genesis 3, right? Because there was the curse on the ground that the Lord placed there. But Noah's birth is framed as hope. And it is framed as hope in this weary world. Like, even before a catastrophe happens, Noah is put there as to what, is going to come. And then, so the genealogy, it ends with Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's basically setting up Genesis 6 and the flood. So what does Genesis 5 mean? All right. First big idea is death is now normal, but it's not original. So that repeated phrase, and he died, that's not just this filler type of thing. It is theological, because Genesis 3 said that death would come. And now Genesis 5 basically shows that death is happening over and over. And what the rhythm is trying to reinforce is that sin's consequence is real. Like, this is the thing that I said would happen, and this is like what is going to happen. And how mortality basically is defining this age. But if you notice something, right, even with that death happening over and over and over again, it still began, Genesis 5 still began by reminding us that humans are still made in God's image. So image remains, blessing still remains, but death also remains. So humanity, it is now dignified, but it is mortal. And second big idea is the line of promise continues. So Genesis 4 showed Cain's line, and throughout Cain's line, violence was basically escalating. Whereas Seth's line is where the people are calling on the Lord. So Genesis 5 specifically looks at Seth's line, not Cain's, because it is showing God still preserving this thread, and history moving, it is still moving somewhere, and it's just not unraveling randomly. So even in a dying world, God is still carrying a redemptive line forward. Redemption still is going to come. And then we get to Enoch, because Enoch is representing intimacy for us, even amongst mortality, right? Enoch walked with God. That is what scripture says. And so walking with God is deeply relational. Okay, so in this chapter that is basically dominated by death, because that is the repeated thing over and over and over again, Enoch is not defined by his lifespan. So he's not defined by this death, but he is defined by relationship, right? So his removal, what happens is that interrupts this death rhythm. So death does not have the ultimate authority. That's basically what they're signaling for us. And a relationship with God transcends mortality, which I feel like this chapter kind of puts like spirituality like in, it, I don't want to say like in its place, but like this is what makes all of this like spiritual, like just understanding, or this thought around the concept of a relationship with God transcending what it is that we are here, like in our, our physical bodies. Next big idea, hope in the middle of toil. So Lamech's naming of Noah basically ties back to Genesis 3. The ground was cursed, work became painful, and toil defines the human experience. This is after sin. But Noah's birth actually represents this longing for relief. Okay, so it is carrying forward for us. Yes, this burden of curse, but Noah gives us this hope of comfort. And why all of this matters in the first place, right? One, because we are now confronting mortality, honestly. So Genesis does not soften death. It just basically repeats it. It's saying life is long because these men lived long, long lives in the context of this chapter of scripture. But death still comes. And so it's kind of like grounding us in some type of realism in the Bible. And then next, right, why it matters is because it's affirming this human dignity even after failure. So even after Eden, Cain's murder, escalating violence, humans are still image bearers, blessing carriers, life producers, okay? And I know we love to talk about like the image of God and being in God's likeness and things of that. And it's crazy because when listening to Power Moves, like Sarah Jakes Roberts was saying, like thinking about like basically God is not this physical thing, right? We can't put a face to God. So in order, when trying to conceptualize being made in God's likeness and God's image, it really makes sense that we are made in the image of God's heart, right? And so even when thinking about like what does that actually look like, when we think about Enoch and this, this line of redemption and Enoch really walking with God, it shows, still made in his likeness and his image, but the image of his heart. So sin like fractures things, but it does not erase image. You can still be in relationship with God. And it's also showing us like God's faithfulness through generations. So the genealogy basically tells us that God works through time, and redemption is slow, and faithfulness spans generations. It's not about just like these big dramatic events that like shape, different perspectives or different ideas in the Bible. It's more so about like continuity. It keeps going. And there's also this introduction of hope, even within decay. So Enoch interrupts death, right? Noah represents comfort, and the line continues because Genesis 5 says death is present, right? But it's not ultimate. And tying this into First Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, really, really short, right? It mentions, again, Adam, Seth. Seth has Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, then Jared, then Enoch, then Methuselah, then Lamech, then Noah, and then Noah has Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? So it's just like this super compressed version of Genesis 5. It's no lifespans. It's not really this repeated and he died. It's just the names, right? And so what this means is, just giving some context, is that First Chronicles was written much later, okay? This was after Israel's exile, okay? But it lets us know, though, that Israel's story begins with humanity. So by starting with Adam, what's happening is we're saying Israel's story just doesn't begin with Abraham. It begins with humanity, and that God's covenant story is rooted in creation, right? Next big thing idea here is that the history is purposeful. So by repeating that genealogy, what happens is the chronicler, he's connecting the past to the present, right? He's anchoring identity and continuity. So it's not just some random ancestry, it's theological lineage. And then identity, it is community, okay? And generational. So for ancient Israel, genealogy meant belonging. It meant inheritance. It did mean legitimacy, but it also meant continuity. So excuse me. This is what is trying to position us into a much larger story. All right. So why does this little short passage even matter in the first place? Basically because it's anchoring the identity after disruption. So Chronicles was written after trauma. By listening to Adam first, what it's saying for us is even exile cannot erase origin, and you still belong to the human story that God began. And it's reframing history as covenant continuity. So it's telling us you are not starting over, you are continuing something ancient. And it's reinforcing for us that God's purpose outlasts collapse. Empires fall, cities get destroyed, generations die. But the names remain, the lineage continues, and God's plan still moves forward. So when you bring Genesis 5 and 1 Chronicles 1 together, they are teaching humanity is moral, death is real, the curse echoes, violence spreads, generations pass, but also the image of God remains. God preserves a faithful line. Relationship with God interrupts death, that's represented specifically by Enoch. Hope appears before judgment. Noah is our representation of that. And then identity still survives exile. So that is what Chronicles is leading us to. Because Genesis 5 is saying even in a dying world, God is still moving history forward. Whereas First Chronicles 1 is saying even after collapse, you are still part of that story. So, right, thinking about mortality not canceling dignity, generational faithfulness mattering, walking with God matters more than lifespan. God's purposes are patient, not rushed. History is not random, it is relational. I then asked Candy Dandy Chat, like, how is it really like teaching us these things? Like, what is this actually really meaning? Okay. And so getting into it, right? How we know that mortality does not cancel dignity. What Genesis 5 is doing, it is repeating for us, and he died over and over and over again. Death is now normal. But when we notice again how that chapter begins, when God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. That reminder appears after Eden, okay, after murder, after exile. So that image of God, because it is mentioned again intentionally, that's trying to tell us that yes, death affects humanity, sin affects humanity, but dignity is still there. You are still made in the likeness, in the image of something bigger than you, God's heart. Okay. Yes, mortality is now part of the human condition, but it is not erasure. It does not erase the image. All right. You can be mortal and still sacred, and you can be fragile and still bear God's likeness. It's basically like this refusal to say because you die you are worthless. Instead, it's like saying like you died and you still matter. And so this next big idea, how this is teaching us that generational faithfulness matters, right? It is tracing this lineage from Adam to Seth all the way to Noah. Now, it could have skipped generations, but it doesn't. And why doesn't it do this is because the Bible is trying to show us that God works through time, through families, and through continuity. So Genesis 4 showed Cain's line that escalated in violence, whereas Seth's line calls on the Lord. So Genesis 5 is like this, this silent saying. It's quietly like telling us like the faithful line continues, okay? Even when culture declines, even when violence spreads, even when death dominates, God is still going to preserve a thread. Faithfulness is not flashy, but it is generational. So one life affects the next. One parent shapes the next story. That's deep, especially thinking like about motherhood. And then one line carries hope forward. All right. Now, why does walking with God matter more than lifespan? When we going back to Enoch, deep diving in him, everyone else, and he died, and he died, and he died. But Enoch, he walked with God and was no more. Enoch lived 365 years, whereas Methuselah lived 969 years. So Methuselah is remembered for the length, but Enoch is remembered for the intimacy. So this is the Bible like highlighting relationship versus longevity for us. So what defines Enoch is not how long he lived, but how he lived in relationship. So this is like teaching us right here specifically like that the measure of a life, it is not duration, how long it is lived, but the direction. Who you walking with, who's with you, where you going. And then God's purposes, being patient and not rushed. So Genesis 5 spans centuries. These people lived for a long time. Hundreds of years passed between names. The story moves slowly. It isn't no big dramatic intervention yet. It's no big sudden reset. It's just births, deaths, continuity. So God actually is not reacting in panic to sin. He's moving history forward deliberately, teaching us that redemption unfolds through time. So God works through generations, not just moments. And patience does not mean absence. And history is not random, it's relational. So genealogies are relational maps. So they tell us like this person came from that person. This story is connected to that story. First Chronicles 1 begins with Adam. Why? Because Israel's story is rooted in humanity's story. Why does this matter? What is it trying to teach me? What's the big idea here? I asked. And it's teaching your story is not isolated. That's a big one. Especially when thinking about, being the first person like in your family to like do something or experience something, or just trying to do something that you feel like you have no direct or like tangible models around you. Like even with that, your story is still not isolated. History is connected, and identity is inherited and shaped by relationship. So the Bible doesn't frame history as chaos. It's framed as lineage and that continuity, but it is framed as this under God's sovereignty. Now, how we get into, right, humanity is mortal, death is real, okay? Genesis 3 warned us, you will return to dust. Genesis 5 confirms, and he died. So death is not a metaphor here. It is a rhythm. It is driving home for us. This is now the human condition. Okay, the Bible is not denying mortality for us. It is normalizing it. This is what it was said was going to happen, and we are not glorifying it. Okay, and it echoes the curse. So in Genesis 4, Cain's ground definitely does resist him. And then in Genesis 5, though, Lamech names Noah, hoping for relief from this painful toil caused by the ground that the Lord cursed. And so the curse is from Genesis 3 is still shaping life, basically. Work is still hard. The earth still resists. Death still intrude. The fall was not momentary. The effects of this echo throughout. Kind of like made me think about like generational curses and like what that really and truly means. Yeah. And then violence spreading, right? So when we think about violence spreading, even the generations are passing, right? So in Genesis 4, Cain murders, and Lamech on Cain's. So Lamech from Cain and then Lamech from Seth, those two different people. Same name. But Lamech from Cain, all right, the descendant of Cain, Lamech, that Lamech, he boasts of escalating revenge, right? Sin multiplies socially, okay? Genesis 5 does not detail violence at all. It just steadily moves towards Noah and the flood, where, violence has filled the earth, but it does not detail these things. So the escalation, right? We see distrust, murder, revenge culture, global corporation. It leads us there, but we're trying to get to Noah. All right. And the generations pass. Life continues. Birth, death, birth, death. History, it don't stop after tragedy. Humanity persists even in brokenness. But also, Genesis never lets despair have the final word. God's image still remains. Humans are made in God's likeness. Even in a violent world, even in a dying world, dignity is going to survive sin. Dignity does survive sin. And God preserves that faithful line. Okay? Genesis 5 traces the worshiping line. God is not absent, he's preserving. Okay? Seth's line preserves the worship, whereas Cain's line was escalating that violence. And that relationship with God, it's interrupting death, because Enoch, that's theologically breaking of the pattern. Okay? Death does not have ultimate authority. Intimacy with God is what is going to transcend. Okay? And I kind of asked, like, is this like this idea of resurrection? But we're going to get into it, because it says, like, it's this whisper of resurrection, but it doesn't, like, name, like, being raised up, brought back from it. So we'll get into that, though, when that comes. And then also hope appearing before judgment. So before the flood, before destruction, before this great reset, Noah is born. His father says he will comfort us. So hope appears even before catastrophe, even before it is like righteously, like outright named. Okay? God does not surprise the world with judgment without preparing hope first. So just keep that in mind. Okay? And identifying for us, right, that identity is going to always survive exile. So First Chronicles, written after exile, right? Why do we still begin with Adam again? Because it is letting us know your story did not start in exile. It started in creation. Okay? Even after loss, even after displacement, even after judgment, identity still remains. God's purposes outlast disaster. Which makes me think about, like, the world that we live in and why this country in particular was so gung-ho on destroying, like, especially Black people. I can only speak for that experience. That's the experience that I live. But, like, why this world is so, like, gung-ho on, erasing, like, our story, and trying to erase, like, our identity and write it to what, and retell it how they want it to be. And it's crazy to think about, because that, like, again, your story didn't start in exile. It started in creation. Like, that's deep, and that's a big chunk to digest, because what it's letting us know is identity, yes, remaining, but God's purposes outlast disaster. And in order to, like, I guess, like, fully grasp that concept, you got to know who you are and who you belong to. Who you are and whose you are. For real, for real. So that makes sense for me. And just getting into the full picture, right? This world is mortal, fractured, it's violent, it's echoing that curse, but it's still connected, it's still dignified, it's still perseverance, it's still hopeful, it is still moving somewhere under God. Like, death is real, but it is not ultimate. Sin spreads, but so does worship. Generations pass, but God's thread, God's hand on things, God's purpose, God's will still remains. And that history is not random. It is relational, and it is held. Okay? So, right, I then asked, like, what actually happens with Enoch? Because when you look at the wording closely, it says Enoch walked with God. So that phrase is basically suggesting, right, when you're walking with God, an ongoing relationship, faithfulness, intimacy, and alignment, okay? It's relational language, not just moral language. And the more I like read and like get into this, and it's like talking about relationship, it really just makes me think like I really almost like why relationships and things like that like don't work out for me is because this is like heavy, and it's heavy work, and I really have had like no idea like what it means to be in relationship like with a thing, like real deal relational context, right? And so only one other person in Genesis is described that way, and that is Noah. So yeah, there's that, right? When thinking about what it means to be like in this ongoing relationship with God. And so then it says that Enoch, then he was no more, okay? It does not say he died. It does not say he was buried. It does not say he was returned to dust. Instead, it says God took him. And so the Hebrew, this implies that there is removal by divine action, and there is this direct transition. So did Enoch die? The text deliberately avoids saying that he died. In Hebrews, though, it is interpreted more explicitly. When we get there, I guess it'll be unpacked a little bit more. But it says, by faith, Enoch was, Hebrews 11:5 says, by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. So being biblically understood, Enoch did not die in the normal way. He was taken directly by God. And that is described as this idea of translation. We'll get there when we get there. And like just being directly taken into God's presence. And why does Genesis highlight him? Because, right, the chapter says death, pause, but not this one. So signaling, yes, death is dominant, but it is not absolute here. And just trying to interrupt that death pattern, okay? And like I've said before, just showing that relationships mattering, of course, more than longevity, all right? So it teaches us, because Enoch lived 365 years, Methuselah lived 969 years. But Genesis is teaching us, though, a long life is not the same as a faithful life, all right? And it is trying to foreshadow like something bigger for us. So this tells us like death does not have the final authority, grounding us in what spirituality, right, is, and that this intimacy is going with God is going to transcend all. Okay. And so, and then thinking about that, I was like, okay, well now what does like walking with God practically mean, okay, for me, okay, for a everyday person, right? So because Genesis 5 verse 24 says Enoch walked with God, then he was no more because God took him. So walking, we're going to break this down with the words, okay? Walking implies ongoing movement, not a moment, okay? Walking is continuous, it is steady, it is directional, it is relational, all right? So I feel like I am walking, or beginning my walk. I trying to like work on continuity, trying to be steady, but also like trying to follow God's direction. So walking is not this single religious event. It's not a dramatic spiritual experience. It is not a one-time act of obedience. Okay. It is basically suggesting daily alignment over time. So practically walking with God means like consistent relational awareness, pattern, not perfection, and then direction, not speed. All right. We ain't gotta go fast. It ain't gotta be this big rush thing. Okay. It's about trajectory, right? And so then next, right, it is implying for us shared direction to walk with someone. And I was like, oh, this is why the relationships and that's why this stuff don't be working, girl. The men's, because to walk with someone, you must move in the same direction, stay near, and adjust pace together. Yeah. And so when you try to apply that spiritually, this means like your values increasingly aligning with God's, your decisions reflecting trust in God, and your life being oriented toward God. It doesn't mean you never fail. It doesn't mean you never doubt. It doesn't mean you never struggle. It just means you keep returning to alignment. And I like this because even though like I struggle, even though it's February. I said I've been wanting to do this every day since January, but I return to alignment. Okay? I'm going to keep on returning. I'm going to keep on starting over. Right? Give God as many chances as you give the men's. Okay? For real. And then this, walking with God, it also is implying intimacy, not just obedience. Because it does not say Enoch obeyed God. It says Enoch walked with God. So that really suggests relationship, communion, and closeness. It is the opposite of hiding, which happened in Genesis 3. And it's the opposite of isolation, which happened with Cain in Genesis 4. So walking with God means not avoiding, right? Not avoiding God, not managing appearances, because I know I tend to do that too. It's just certain stuff sometimes like I won't pray about, won't like really repent about, won't like speak about, because I know me and I know where my heart lies. But it's like, if you know you, guess who know you even better? God. And then not distancing after failure, because that is, I know for sure that is, I retreat for sure. And it just, I would rather like suffer alone in silence versus just saying, hey, I messed up again. So what it means, right, that walk with God is staying present. Okay, now next we are getting into implying trust. Walking with God means implying trust in a world where death is normal. Okay? Because Genesis 5 is dominated by the phrase, and he died, and he died, and he died. So to walk with God in that context means living relationally in a mortal world, trusting God even though you're surrounded by decay, and then remaining faithful, right? Even though everything around you is like deteriorating. Okay, so it's just this quiet faithfulness even in ordinary times. So what would this look like, today, right? For me, and maybe for you too, honest prayer, obedience when it costs something, refusing bitterness even when comparison is tempting you, confessing instead of hiding, long-term faithfulness over emotional spikes, and then choosing restraint when anger crouches at the door. So it's like this steady relational heart posture, not spiritual drama. Okay. And my last question, right, to chat. Well, I had to actually thinking about like, is Enoch actually resurrected or is something else? It's not resurrection exactly. He's translated, right? So resurrection means death occurs and then life is restored afterwards. But Enoch doesn't experience death first. He's taken, and that's this process that's called translation. But it does foreshadow something greater. And Enoch is that hint that, God can override any decay. There's this crack in like this, inevitability of like death and just like mortality being absolute. And it develops like this later hope that death is still going to be defeated. God is still going to swallow up mortality, and the righteous actually will live beyond the grave. So Enoch is this sign that the relationship with God is going to transcend this biological limitation. Okay? And so we know that this walk is just this faithful direction over time, steady relational alignment, and this early sign that God's purposes go beyond like what we can see in the physical. And then my last big question was, of the men that were listed and mentioned, I wanted to know like why, right? Why is it that Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, and then the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth? Why are they the only ones who are like mentioned? And what the breakdown is this. So it says like Genesis 5 is not trying to list every human alive, provide this full population record, or give like this big exhaustive family tree. It just wants to trace specifically the line of promise, not the complete line of humanity. Because the chapter, of course, it says like each of these men had other sons and daughters. So it's explicitly like telling us that these are not the only children. These are not the only people. This is a selected lineage, okay? But why these men specifically, okay? One is tracing the covenant line. So this is the redemptive thread. Okay, so after Cain kills Abel in Genesis 4, we split into two streams. Cain's line, which is trying to escalate violence, and then Seth, again, those people who are calling on the name of the Lord, right? Why is that? Because the Bible is tracing exactly for us. This is the preservation of the faithful worship. This is the line through which God's purpose is going to move forward. And then eventually, this is the line that is going to lead to Noah, then Abraham, then David, then Christ. Okay? So it's not about the biology. It's about the theological continuity. Okay? So it only is listing like the key individuals. These are the people that actually carry that story forward. And genealogies in the Bible are selective, okay, not exhaustive. So it says ancient genealogies were structured, often symbolic, purpose-driven, theological, not modern birth records, okay? So fathered in Hebrew can actually mean direct son, descendant, or ancestor of. So it is possible that some names are omitted. The structure may be styled. Generation, is scoped in a specific way. And Genesis 5 lists these 10 names from Adam to Noah. And so in Hebrew thought, 10 is a symbolic number of completeness as well. And so this suggests this intentional structure, not just some random inclusion. And then the focus is on continuity through male lineage. So in the ancient world, legal inheritance flowed through fathers. Clan identity was traced through male descent. Covenant continuity, it was recorded through the men. So it does not mean that women are absent. Women were unimportant. Only these men existed, all right? But what it is trying to tell us is it's structured to how lineage and inheritance were recorded at that time. So every entry included he had other sons and daughters. Women are present. They're just not individually named in this specific record. And then, of course, we know why Enoch only gets extra detail, because he walked with God. Just, again, overemphasizing that relationship. And it's an intentional right pause. And then why Noah is listed at the end, because Noah is like this hinge. So everything from Genesis 1 through 5 is building towards the corruption of humanity, which we'll get into in Genesis 6, the flood, which is to come, and then the preservation of one family. So Genesis 5 is basically doing this type of thing. So Adam, with mortality entering generations, death repeats. Enoch, death is interrupted once. Noah, now judgment and preservation are coming. So it's like this bridge chapter, okay? Because what it's going to do for us is slowly unfold God's purpose, and then show us that the line is about moving towards deliverance. So not trying to exclude others, but trying to narrow the focus to this thread, this moving train that like God is carrying forward. All right, so what happens is, it's not record keeping, it's just this quiet reassurance saying that even as death spreads, even as violence grows, even as generations pass, God's line is still going to continue. That's what I got.